The flight begins with a cruel remark. Zora Washington had always been aware of how the world saw her. Some people viewed her with pity, others with judgment, and a few with outright disdain. As a black woman who carried more weight than society deemed acceptable, she had endured whispers in department stores, smirks in restaurants, and unsolicited advice from strangers who thought her body was a topic for public discussion. But she had built resilience over time, a second skin her grandmother called it, armor woven from years of self-love and hard-earned confidence. Still, some days, the armor felt thin. As she stepped onto Flight 4371 bound for New York, that feeling crept in. The tight confines of the airplane, the subtle side-eyes from fellow passengers, and the hushed whispers that followed her as she made her way down the narrow aisle all chipped away at her resolve. She kept her head high, adjusting the strap of her leather tote bag over her shoulder. She glanced at her boarding pass. Seat 22B, middle seat. Not her first choice, but she had booked late, and the airline had assured her the flight was full. She exhaled softly and made her way to row 22. The moment she arrived, her heart sank. The window seat was already occupied by a man in his late 40s, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, a silver wedding band glinting under the fluorescent lights. His suit, crisp and expensive, spoke of wealth, but his expression told a different story, one of barely concealed irritation as he took in her presence. She braced herself. "Excuse me," she said politely, offering a small smile. "I believe I'm in the middle seat." The man sighed, an exaggerated, drawn-out sound. Without a word, he closed his laptop and unbuckled his seatbelt, moving just enough to let her pass, but making it abundantly clear that he wasn't happy about it. As she carefully maneuvered past him, her hip brushed against the armrest. His disgust was instant. He recoiled, pressing himself against the window as if she carried something contagious. The shift was so abrupt that he bumped his head lightly against the side of the plane. Zora flinched. "I'm sorry," she murmured, though it wasn't her fault. He didn't respond. Instead, he exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple as if she had somehow caused him personal injury. Zora sat down, trying to ignore the prickling heat rising to her cheeks. She secured her seatbelt, folding her hands neatly in her lap, eyes fixed straight ahead. But she could feel his discomfort radiating beside her. She had encountered men like him before, ones who believed their money gave them the right to dictate who deserved to exist in their space. As she tried to calm her nerves, the aisle seat remained empty for a moment longer, offering a brief reprieve. Then a young woman approached, a baby strapped to her chest, a diaper bag slung over one shoulder, and a carry-on suitcase in tow. She looked flustered but determined. "Hi, I think I'm in 22C, she said, offering an apologetic smile. Zora immediately moved her purse, offering space for the woman to settle in. But before she could, the businessman next to her spoke. "There must be a mistake," he said sharply. "I'm in the window seat, 22A. The young woman blinked. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I think I misread it. Yep, I'm in 22C, the aisle seat." The man's lips pressed into a thin line as he muttered something under his breath. Zora caught it. Perfect. As the mother settled in, gently bouncing the fussy baby, the tension in their row became undeniable. The businessman shifted in his seat, arms crossing over his chest as he leaned against the window, putting as much distance as possible between himself and Zora. It was a silent protest. A message. Zora took up too much space, and he wanted her to know it. The plane quickly filled, overhead bins slamming shut as last-minute passengers scurried to their seats. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, performing final checks. The intercom crackled as the pilot welcomed them aboard. Zora focused on her breathing. She had been here before. She knew how to make herself small. She tucked her elbows tightly against her sides, shoulders hunched slightly forward. adopting the familiar posture of someone who had spent years trying to take up less room in a world that constantly reminded her she occupied too much. Then the businessman struck the final blow. "Excuse me," he called over a passing flight attendant. A woman with blonde hair neatly pinned into a bun stopped beside their row. Her name tag read Jessica. "Yes, sir." The businessman leaned slightly toward her, his voice carrying just enough volume to be heard by those around him. "Is there any way I can switch seats?" Jessica frowned. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're fully booked today." He sighed. "First class, then." Jessica offered a polite but firm smile. "Unfortunately, first class is also full." His jaw tensed. "Well, what about another seat in economy?" "Anything." Jessica hesitated. "May I ask if there's an issue with your current seat?" Zora already knew what was coming before the words even left his mouth. He exhaled sharply, dropping his voice just enough to feign discretion, but still loud enough for Zora and the young mother to hear. "I paid for a full seat," he said, "but I'm only getting 3/4 of one." Silence. Zora's heart clenched. It wasn't the words themselves. She had heard worse. It was the casual cruelty of it. The way he dismissed her as if she weren't a person but an inconvenience. Jessica's eyes flickered toward Zora, her professional expression faltering for a moment. The young mother beside her gasped softly. The businessman, however, seemed completely unbothered. Jessica cleared her throat. "Sir, as I mentioned, we are at full capacity. There are no additional seats available." His lips pursed, clearly displeased. "Fine." He waved her off. Zora's pulse thundered in her ears. She kept her eyes locked on her lap, willing herself not to react. She had spent years pretending remarks like that didn't hurt. But today, it stung. And then, before Jessica could move on, a deep voice from the row behind them cut through the tension like a blade. "That's enough." A hush fell over the surrounding passengers. The businessman stiffened. Jessica turned toward the voice. Zora swallowed, her breath hitching in her throat. Someone had spoken up. For her. Slowly, she turned her head, meeting the eyes of the man behind them. He was tall, dark-skinned, and well-dressed, his tailored navy blue suit hinting at both success and confidence. But it wasn't his appearance that struck Zora. It was his expression. Calm, unwavering, and filled with a quiet fury. He leaned forward slightly. "You've said enough," he repeated, his voice steady but firm. The businessman frowned, clearly irritated. "Excuse me." "You heard me," the stranger replied. "Now apologize." For the first time since the flight began, the businessman looked uncomfortable. Zora, however, felt something else entirely. Hope. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone. A stranger's stand and an unforgettable offer. For a moment, silence hung in the air like a held breath. Passengers seated nearby had paused their conversations, their ears subtly tuned in to the tension unfolding in row 22. Flight attendants, finishing up final checks, exchanged wary glances, likely debating whether to intervene. Zora felt the weight of every eye on her, yet her focus remained on the stranger who had spoken up. He looked to be in his late 30s or early 40s, his neatly trimmed beard peppered with hints of silver. His dark brown skin was smooth, his sharp jawline holding a quiet strength. The navy blue suit he wore was fitted perfectly, his crisp white dress shirt peeking out just enough to hint at affluence. But it wasn't his appearance that captivated Zora. It was his unwavering confidence. The businessman beside her shifted in his seat, his discomfort evident. He straightened his tie as if trying to reassert control of the situation. "Excuse me," he repeated, this time with a forced laugh. "Who do you think you are?" The stranger leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together. His tone remained measured but firm. "I think I'm someone who doesn't stand by while others are disrespected." Zora's breath hitched. The businessman scoffed. "I wasn't disrespecting anyone. I was just stating facts." He gestured toward Zora without even looking at her. I paid for my seat, and I have a right to be comfortable. The stranger's expression didn't waver. And she has the right to exist without being humiliated. Zora swallowed hard. She had never had anyone stand up for her like this. At least, not in such a public way. People usually avoided confrontation, preferring to pretend they hadn't heard the insults, the microaggressions, the subtle jabs meant to diminish her existence. But this man, he wasn't backing down. Jessica, the flight attendant, cleared her throat, clearly trying to maintain order. "Sir," she said to the businessman, her voice gentle but firm, "I understand that space is limited, but we must be respectful of all passengers." The businessman let out an exaggerated sigh, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous." He turned to Zora, finally meeting her eyes for the first time since she sat down. "Look, I..." "Don't," the stranger interrupted. The businessman narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me." The stranger leaned back slightly, his lips curling into a small, knowing smile. "If you're about to offer some half-hearted apology just to save face, don't bother." The businessman's face darkened. "I don't owe anyone an apology." "Oh, you do," the stranger said, his voice dangerously calm. "But since you clearly lack the decency to give one, allow me to do something better." With that, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. Zora blinked, confused. The businessman frowned. "What are you doing?" The stranger smiled, but his eyes were sharp, giving her the respect she deserves. He turned his attention to Jessica. "Are there any available seats in first class?" Jessica hesitated. "Sir, as I mentioned earlier, first class is fully booked." The stranger pulled out his wallet, flipping it open with practiced ease. Inside, a sleek black card gleamed under the cabin lights. The type of card only a select few carried. "Check again," he said smoothly. "Because I'd like to buy someone's seat." A hushed murmur spread through the nearby passengers. Zora's heart pounded. "Wait," she started, but the stranger held up a hand, his expression kind. Jessica blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Sir, that's highly unusual." "Unusual doesn't mean impossible," he countered. "See what you can do." Jessica hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I'll speak to the head attendant." She disappeared toward the front of the plane. Zora turned to the stranger, her mind spinning. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. He smiled. "I know." The businessman let out a dry chuckle. "Oh, so what? You're playing hero now." The stranger's smile didn't falter. "I don't need to play anything. I just do what's right." The businessman scoffed. "Oh, please. This is nothing but a show." The stranger's expression turned serious. If standing up for others is a show, then maybe more people should be performing. Zora couldn't look away. For so long, she had convinced herself that she didn't need anyone's help, that she could handle the world's cruelty on her own. But now, as she sat between two men, one who sought to diminish her and one who sought to uplift her, she realized something. She didn't always have to fight alone. Jessica returned a moment later, her face a mixture of surprise and amusement. "Well, this is a first," she said, shaking her head. "There's a passenger in first class willing to trade seats for a price." The stranger nodded. "How much?" Jessica glanced at her tablet. "He's willing to give up his seat for $5,000. A collective gasp rippled through the nearby passengers. The businessman laughed mockingly. "You wouldn't actually pay that, would you?" Zora gripped the armrest. "That's way too much." But the stranger didn't even blink. He reached into his wallet, pulled out the sleek black card, and handed it to Jessica. "Charge it." The businessman's smirk faded. Jessica hesitated, as if giving him one last chance to back out. When he didn't, she swiped the card. A beep confirmed the transaction. Jessica turned to Zora. "Ma'am, you'll be moving to seat 1A. Zora's mouth went dry. "Wait, what?" she stammered. The stranger turned to her, his smile warm. I told you, you deserve respect, and a little bit of comfort too. The businessman shook his head in disbelief. This is absurd. The stranger raised a brow. What's absurd is that you thought it was okay to belittle someone for existing. Zora hesitated, a storm of emotions swirling in her chest. Part of her wanted to decline, to prove that she didn't need saving. But another part of her, the part that had been wounded by the businessman's words, the part that had spent years enduring the quiet cruelties of the world, wanted to accept. Not because she needed rescuing, but because, for once, she wanted to accept kindness without guilt. She met the stranger's gaze. "Thank you," she said softly. His smile widened. "Any time." With that, Jessica helped Zora gather her things. As she stood, she caught sight of the businessman's face. His expression was tight, his jaw clenched, his pride wounded in a way she knew he would never admit. Zora didn't care. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. As she made her way to first class, she glanced back one last time. The stranger gave her a small nod. And for the first time that day, she truly smiled. The weight of the past and the power of the present. Zora settled into seat 1A, her mind still reeling from the whirlwind of events. The luxurious first-class cabin was unlike anything she had ever experienced before. The plush leather seat cradled her body like a cloud, stretching wide enough that, for the first time in hours, she didn't feel like she had to make herself smaller. The flight attendant, a different one from before, approached with a warm smile. "Welcome to first class, Ms. Washington. Can I offer you a drink before takeoff?" Zora hesitated. She wasn't used to this kind of treatment. She was used to wary glances, dismissive service, and people treating her like an inconvenience. Not this. She cleared her throat. "Just water, please." "Absolutely." The flight attendant returned moments later with a chilled glass of sparkling water, setting it down gently. "If you need anything else, don't hesitate to ask." Zora nodded and thanked her. But as she sipped the water, her mind drifted back to the man in row 22, the stranger who had changed the course of her flight with a single act of kindness. Who was he? And more importantly, why had he done it? She had spent so much of her life building walls, telling herself that kindness was rare, that people rarely intervened in the face of cruelty. But today, someone had proved her wrong. Her fingers traced the cool surface of the water glass as memories she had buried long ago bubbled to the surface. A lifetime of less than. Growing up in Atlanta, Zora had always been the biggest girl in her class. The taunts started early, the whispered insults turning into outright bullying by middle school. "Why do you even run in gym? It's not like you'll get any faster. She's too big to sit with us. She'll break the bench." And then the deeper insults, the ones that carved wounds into her soul. She'd be pretty if she just lost weight. By high school, the bullying had shifted from words to something worse: silence. Being ignored. Being overlooked. It was as if people had collectively decided she wasn't worth noticing, except when it was time to judge her. She learned to keep her head down, to avoid confrontation, to take up as little space as possible, even though the world always seemed to remind her that she took up too much. When she entered college, she had hoped things would change, that people would be kinder, more mature. But the world didn't work that way. She had lost count of the times she had been treated differently because of her size, because of the color of her skin, because she didn't fit neatly into the mold society had deemed acceptable. And yet, through it all, she had fought. She had earned her degree in marketing while working 2 jobs. She had built a successful career despite the biases that often tried to hold her back. But some wounds, they never fully healed. She had spent so long telling herself she was strong, that she didn't need anyone's help. But today, for the first time in a long time, someone had helped her without expecting anything in return. Why? A conversation that changes everything. Zora was lost in thought when she heard the shuffle of movement nearby. She turned her head just in time to see someone slipping into the seat beside her. It was him. The stranger. Zora blinked, startled. "Wait, you're in first class too." He chuckled, settling into his seat. "I always fly first class." He turned to face her. "But I wasn't going to take my seat until I knew you were comfortable in yours." Zora's throat went dry. This man, this complete stranger, had spent thousands of dollars just to ensure she was treated with respect. And now he had chosen to sit next to her. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His expression softened. "Because I know what it's like to be underestimated." Zora frowned. "You?" He nodded. "I wasn't always in a position to fly first class. I wasn't always someone people respected." He paused, then added, "I had to fight for that." Zora studied him. There was something in his eyes, a deep understanding, a history of battles fought in silence. "I don't even know your name," she admitted. He extended a hand. "Julian Carter." She shook it hesitantly, his grip firm yet warm. "Zora Washington." A small smile touched his lips. "Nice to meet you, Zora." She let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "Nice to meet you, too." For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence as the plane began to taxi toward the runway. Then Julian spoke again. "You know, that man back there, he's not unique." Zora sighed, rubbing her temples. "I know. I've met 100 versions of him throughout my life." Julian nodded. "And each time, you let it roll off your back, right?" She hesitated, then nodded. "That's what you do when you don't have another choice." He tilted his head. "Or maybe that's what you do when you've convinced yourself that fighting back won't change anything." Zora frowned, her heart pounding slightly. "People like him," Julian continued, "get away with it because no one calls them out. But what if someone did? What if, every time, people pushed back?" Zora exhaled, shaking her head. "The world doesn't work like that." Julian's smile was small but knowing. Maybe not yet, but it could. Something about the way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. Was it really that simple? Could people like her, people who had spent their lives shrinking themselves, really claim their space in the world? As the plane lifted off, Zora stared out the window, deep in thought. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop making herself smaller. Maybe it was time to take up the space she had always deserved. An unfinished story. Julian watched her carefully, as if he could see the storm of emotions passing through her. Then, in a voice so soft it almost got lost in the hum of the aircraft, he said, "You don't need permission to exist, Zora. You never did." Zora closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the words settle into her soul. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. And for the first time in forever, she believed it. The burden of silence and the power of voice. The plane soared higher into the sky, leaving the city behind, but Zora's thoughts remained grounded in something far deeper than altitude. Julian's words echoed in her mind. "You don't need permission to exist, Zora. You never did." Something about them unsettled her, not in a bad way, but in a way that made her chest tighten with emotions she wasn't sure she was ready to unpack. For years, she had built a fortress around herself, reinforced by silence, patience, and endurance. It was how she had survived, how she had won in a world that wasn't always kind to people like her. But had she really won, or had she just learned to endure? Zora turned to Julian, studying him with quiet curiosity. Who was this man, really? He had come to her defense without hesitation, without fear, as if he had spent a lifetime fighting battles like this. "What do you do, Julian?" she finally asked. He leaned back in his seat, stretching out comfortably. "I own a few businesses," he said casually. Zora arched an eyebrow. "A few." He chuckled. "I run a foundation, too." "A foundation?" Julian nodded, his expression turning more serious. "It focuses on social equity." creating spaces where people who've been overlooked their whole lives can finally get the opportunities they deserve. Zora stared at him, caught off guard. You mean, like? He met her gaze, his eyes steady. Like women who get dismissed in boardrooms. Like kids who are told they won't make it because of where they come from. Like people who are treated as less than because they don't fit into someone else's idea of what's acceptable. A lump formed in Zora's throat. She shifted in her seat, her fingers brushing against the cool leather of the armrest. That's incredible. Julian smiled, but there was something knowing in his expression. It's necessary. Zora exhaled, glancing back at the economy section. She could still feel the weight of the businessman's judgment, the way he had dismissed her as if she wasn't worthy of the same air he breathed. And yet, she had let him do it. She had let him make her feel small, because that was what she had been trained to do her whole life. To ignore, to endure, to shrink. Julian must have noticed the shift in her expression because his voice softened. Tell me something, Zora. She turned back to him. What? His gaze held hers. When was the first time someone made you feel like you weren't enough? Her heart clenched. That was the thing about painful memories. You never truly buried them. They just lingered, waiting to be unwrapped by the right, or wrong, moment. For Zora, that moment had come in 3rd grade, a memory that never left. It had been a warm autumn day when her teacher, Miss Caldwell, decided to rearrange the classroom seating. We're going to do something fun, she had said, her smile too wide. Everyone will get a buddy for the semester, someone new to sit next to and learn with. The excitement had been palpable. Zora had loved school. She had loved learning. And even though she was shy, she had hoped this would be a chance to finally make a new friend. But then, the pairings began. Name after name was called, each student moving excitedly to their new seat. Then, finally, Zora, you'll sit with Brian. She had turned to look at Brian Watson, a boy with sandy brown hair and bright blue eyes. He had been one of the popular kids, the kind who always had friends waiting for him at recess. For the briefest moment, she had smiled, hopeful. But Brian had groaned. Ooh, why do I have to sit with her? He had complained, loud enough for the entire class to hear. Zora's heart had plummeted. Miss Caldwell had chuckled, waving a hand. Now, Brian, let's be kind. But that was it. No reprimand. No acknowledgement of how humiliating it was for an 8-year-old girl to be rejected so publicly. The whole class had laughed, as if Brian had said something harmless. But it hadn't been harmless. It had been the moment, the exact moment Zora had started to see herself the way the world did. Too big, too different, too much. She had stopped raising her hand as much after that. Stopped trying to join conversations at lunch. She had learned that being ignored was sometimes easier than being noticed. Breaking the silence. Julian waited patiently as Zora processed the memory, her jaw tightening slightly. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before. 3rd grade. He tilted his head. That young? She nodded, swallowing hard. That's the first time I remember it. But it happened again. And again. Until I just accepted it. Julian's gaze darkened. And you think that's okay? Zora frowned. I think that's how the world works. His lips pressed into a thin line before he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the tray table. Do you want to know the difference between people who change the world and people who survive it? Zora exhaled sharply. Let me guess. The ones who change it don't accept the way things are. Julian gave her a small, approving nod. Exactly. She let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. Easier said than done. Julian's expression didn't waver. It's always easier said than done. That doesn't make it any less necessary. Zora stared at him, her heart hammering. Something inside her, something deep, buried, forgotten, began to stir. She had spent her whole life staying quiet. She had spent her whole life accepting that this was just how things were. But what if she was wrong? What if she didn't have to endure? What if she could fight back? The thought sent a chill through her, because for the first time in her life, she realized that silence had never protected her. It had only chained her. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to break free. A new decision. The flight attendant returned, interrupting her thoughts. "Ms. Washington, is there anything else I can get for you?" Zora hesitated, then shook her head. "No, thank you." But as the flight continued, as she sat next to a man who had reminded her of something she had long forgotten, she realized something. Today, someone had stood up for her. But tomorrow, she would stand up for herself. The fire inside. As the flight cruised at 35,000 feet, Zora found herself in unfamiliar territory, not because of the first-class seat, the extra legroom, or even the gourmet meal she hadn't touched. It was because of the storm inside her. She had spent so many years suppressing it, tamping it down, making herself smaller, convincing herself that this was the way things were. But something had cracked open. And now the fire she had ignored for so long refused to be silenced. She glanced out the window, watching the endless stretch of clouds as if they held the answers. But the truth wasn't out there. It was inside her, waiting. The weight of the past. Zora thought back to all the unspoken moments, the injustices she had swallowed like bitter pills. She thought of the manager at her old job who had dismissed her promotion request, saying she lacked the right image for a leadership role. She thought of the ex-boyfriend who had loved her in private but refused to introduce her to his family because he didn't want the judgment. She thought of the saleswoman who watched her like a hawk every time she walked into an expensive store, as if her very presence was a threat. And she thought of all the times she had smiled, nodded, and walked away, as if she agreed that she didn't belong. But what if she stopped walking away? What if she fought back? Her fingers curled into fists in her lap, and for the first time, she felt something new, something dangerous, something powerful. Julian's truth. Julian had been watching her quietly, sensing the shift in her. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" She turned to him, startled. Thinking about what? His lips curved into a knowing smile. What it would feel like to finally push back. Her heart pounded, but she didn't deny it. Julian leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. "It's terrifying, isn't it? The idea that you could fight back, but that once you do, you can never go back to who you were before." Zora exhaled slowly, her gaze dropping to her hands. "It's overwhelming." Julian nodded. "That's because you've spent your whole life playing by someone else's rules, and now, for the first time, you're wondering what it would feel like to break them." Zora swallowed hard. "What if I fail?" Julian's expression softened. "You will fail. At least once. Maybe a dozen times. Maybe 100. But failure isn't the end. It's the beginning." She looked at him, her chest tight with emotions she couldn't name. "You make it sound so simple." Julian chuckled. "It's not. It's brutal. It's exhausting. And sometimes, it feels like you're shouting into a void." His voice dropped lower. "But then, one day, someone else hears you. And they find the courage to speak up too. And then another. And another." He tilted his head. "That's how revolutions start, Zora." Her breath caught in her throat. She had never thought of herself as a revolutionary. She had never thought of herself as anything more than a survivor. But now she wasn't sure what she was. And that realization, it terrified her. The businessman returns. Just then, the curtain separating first class from economy rustled, and the last person she wanted to see step through. The businessman. Zora stiffened, the fire inside her flaring instantly. He walked with purpose, his jaw set, his lips pursed in disapproval. His gaze swept the first-class cabin before landing directly on her. Julian noticed him too, and his relaxed posture shifted, his shoulders squaring, his expression darkening. The businessman cleared his throat. "I'd like a word." Julian didn't move, his voice like steel. "You're in the wrong section." The businessman's lips thinned, but he ignored Julian. His eyes drilled into Zora, as if demanding she acknowledge him. Zora held his stare. For once, she didn't shrink, didn't look away, didn't pretend she didn't belong. "I want to apologize," the businessman said stiffly. The words sounded forced, mechanical, like they had been pried out of him. Zora arched an eyebrow. "Do you?" His nostrils flared slightly, but he nodded. I may have spoken out of turn earlier." Julian scoffed. "That's what you call it." The businessman's jaw clenched, but he stayed focused on Zora. "I just wanted to say that I didn't mean to cause offense." Zora stared at him, really looking at him for the first time, and she saw what she had never noticed before. He wasn't angry. He was ashamed, not because of what he had done, but because he had been called out for it. And suddenly, Zora understood something deep in her bones. This wasn't about her. It had never been about her. He had treated her poorly because he could, because the world had taught him that people like him could do that to people like her without consequences. But today, there had been consequences. And that was why he had come. Not because he cared, but because for the first time in his life, someone had told him no. Zora tilted her head. "You don't have to apologize to me." The businessman blinked. She smiled, not a small smile, not a forced smile, a real one, one filled with quiet power. "You have to apologize to yourself," she said, "for being the kind of person who needed to be called out in the first place." The businessman's face reddened. He looked like he wanted to argue, but for the first time, he had nothing to say. Zora didn't either, because for the first time in her life, she had said enough. The businessman turned abruptly, walking away without another word. Julian whistled low. "Damn Zora." She exhaled slowly, her hands trembling slightly, but not with fear. With something else. Something unstoppable. Julian grinned. That felt good, didn't it? Zora let out a small laugh, her heart pounding. "It felt like the start of something," she admitted. Julian raised his glass. "To more starts, then." Zora lifted hers too, a quiet promise settling inside her. Because today was the first day she refused to shrink. And tomorrow, the world better be ready. A new flight path. Zora had never felt this light before. Not because she was in first class. Not because of the extra legroom, the warm towel, or the complimentary champagne. But because, for the first time in years, she had done something she never thought she could. Stand her ground. It was a quiet victory. But it was hers. And as the businessman disappeared behind the first-class curtain, she felt something settle inside her. She wasn't going back. The view from above. The plane began its descent into Atlanta. Outside, the city shimmered beneath the golden hues of the setting sun, its skyscrapers casting long shadows across the horizon. Zora gazed at the landscape, her heart steady in her chest. She thought about the past few hours, how a simple flight had turned into something bigger. She had stepped onto this plane expecting nothing, but she was stepping off changed. Julian stretched beside her, letting out a satisfied sigh. Almost home. She glanced at him. Home. "Yeah, I live in Atlanta," he said, smirking. "You?" She nodded. "Born and raised." Julian raised an eyebrow. "Then why do you look like you're about to step into the unknown?" Zora smiled softly. "Because maybe I am." Julian studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, maybe you are." She took a deep breath. I don't want to forget this feeling." Julian grinned. "Then don't." An unfinished story. As the plane touched down, Zora felt her phone vibrate in her pocket. She pulled it out, seeing a text from her best friend, Danielle. "Girl, you land yet? I'm starving, and you owe me a dinner for bailing on brunch last weekend." Zora laughed, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then another text popped up. Also, remember, you're a whole damn masterpiece. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Zora's throat tightened. She hadn't told Danielle about what had happened on the plane yet, but somehow her friend already knew what she needed to hear. She smiled, typing back. Dinner's on me, and I have a story for you. The final encounter. As Zora walked toward baggage claim, a familiar voice called out behind her. Ms. Washington. She turned, and there he was, the businessman. She stiffened slightly but didn't flinch. Something you need? She asked, her voice calm. He hesitated. For the first time, he looked uncertain. I thought about what you said, he admitted. Zora crossed her arms. And he exhaled. You were right. It wasn't about you. It was about me. And I didn't like what I saw. She studied him. His posture wasn't as rigid, his expression not as sharp. Maybe he really was learning. Or maybe he was just trying to make himself feel better. Either way, it wasn't her job to fix him. She simply nodded. Good luck with that. Then, without another word, she walked away. Because today wasn't about him. It was about her. And she had places to go. A new beginning. As Zora stepped outside, the warm Atlanta air wrapped around her like a promise. A taxi pulled up, and she climbed in, setting her carry-on beside her. Where to? The driver asked. She hesitated. Then she smiled. Home, she said. But deep down she knew this wasn't just a ride to her apartment. This was the beginning of something new. And this time, she was ready. The world better be too.